Let's proceed with this talk. I'm Robert Burton, and welcome to this talk on webhooks. Before we really get going, I wanted to take just a moment to essentially acknowledge and thank all of the great and wonderful sponsors of Collabsphere 2021. It's the sponsorship of these particular companies that literally paid for all of the expenses of Collabsphere. So without their sponsorship, Collabsphere simply would not have happened. So as for me, I'm Robert Burton. I'm technical director at Phora Group. And if you've been to previous Collabspheres, you'll probably know Phora Group as, oh, that's Richard Moy's company. In fact, I think more people can actually see it, understand it as Richard Moy's company than can as my company. I'm an HCL ambassador. I've been working in Domino and Note since version 3. And also in terms of my point of emphasis, that's workflow and process automation. And before I jump to any more slides, I just want to make sure everyone can see the screen share right now. So I'm not seeing anything back, so I'm assuming that is. If there's a problem of any kind, then just let me know with a response back. Okay, great. So a little bit about webhooks. I've been using webhooks for several years now. I don't consider myself an expert on webhooks, but just from an experience standpoint, I was forced to use them. I think the first one I ever dealt with was DocuSign, and that was back about 5 or 6 years ago. And I've used them ever since, and they're very useful, and I do a lot with them on a Domino server using just Lotus script and web agents, although there are other ways to make use of them as well. I would think that pretty much any good Domino developer or programmer can easily make use of webhooks, but there's some conceptual things you have to understand about them, and then just the research you have to do on each and every webhook that you want to implement. So I'm hoping that this can provide like a shortcut to some of that stuff, but there is a certain amount of learning curve you have to do for each and every webhook. So what is a webhook? A webhook is just a way for an external service to send data to your application. In this case, it's probably going to be an external service that you're already using or making use of. Ones that I've personally dealt with are Zoom, Eventbrite, Rocket Chat, DocuSign, Twilio, and many others. It's almost hard to find a service that doesn't use webhooks these days, although you may have to drill down quite a ways to actually find out how you get at the webhooks. So what can a webhook tell you? All kinds of stuff. It depends on the service, really. A webhook can tell you when an order was received, when a meeting was started or ended, when a document was signed, if someone changed their account settings, when an order is actually ready, when something is shipped. Depending on what the service does and what webhooks they support, almost any kind of notification functionality can be done with a webhook. A webhook is almost always, I say usually, it's almost always triggered by an event. When it is triggered, the webhook will send data to your application. Therefore, it's really a form of push technology. And the great thing about push technology is that your application does not have to do anything. It doesn't have to do any polling. If you wanted to find out when an order was placed, for example, you would have to either poll it every few minutes or perhaps try to do something where it might send you an email and then you would have to try to process that email. Well, you can think of a webhook as really like a super fast email that goes directly into your processing code. And that's the nice thing about webhooks. The downside of webhooks is that your application has to be able to receive and process webhooks, and that takes some programming time and some configuration. Webhooks have been around for a long time. Actually, some of these names go back to before I was using webhooks. Since 2016, they've always been called webhooks. But I did some research, and at one time they were called web callback functions, which in the world of programming would actually be a very appropriate name for what they're doing. And in some old services, they're just called HTTP push. So what does a webhook actually do? How does it work? It uses the HTTP post method to send data to your server. So therefore, your application has to be able to receive HTTP posts requests. And if you're doing this on a Domino server, that means the HTTP task has to be up and running. The important data will be in the body of the post. Possible data formats are JSON, which is really the most common today. I'd say about 90% of what I see today is JSON comment. So JSON content. So therefore, you need to be able to parse in your code that you're going to write, be able to parse JSON. If it's simple JSON, you can probably get at it just by using string manipulation commands. But if you have any kind of a decent JSON parser, it makes it really easy to work with the body content of a lot of web services. XML is still used. It's a bit uncommon today. The only one that I know of right now is that DocuSign still uses a lot of XML in their webhooks. But even DocuSign is switching over. I think they're now, this year for the first time, they're actually supporting JSON in their webhooks, but I think XML is the default. And then here's an odd one I just read about doing research on this, form data. I've never actually had to use one that sent me form data, which is really like submitting a form over the web using multi-part MIME. I would call that rare. I think you can get by an awful lot without ever having to worry about that. Okay, your application must be able to receive incoming post requests from an outside source. Keep in mind that that outside source is going to be completely unauthenticated. It's going to come in as anonymous. So you have to essentially make sure that you're receiving such requests on your server. As I said before, the HTTP task has to be running. You can think of this whole process is that your application is functioning as an API for the webhook. And an API, I mean standard program application programming interface, and a web API is what you're really writing. I kind of think of it as a reverse API, because normally when you write an API, what you're doing is you're creating the API and you have complete control over what functionality you're going to have, what parameters are passed, and how it operates. A webhook is like developing a reverse API because the external service is going to say to you, this is our webhook structure. This is how we make the call. This is what we're expecting you to respond with, if there is a response. And most importantly, we're defining the data structure. So essentially they're saying, here's the webhook, design an API for this webhook. So if you're already familiar with writing APIs, such as web agents, which actually I've been doing for years, and that's still almost my preferred method, although there are a lot of other options available. If you can write APIs on a Domino server, then you are well prepared for using webhooks. Conceptually, setting up and using a webhook is quite simple. On the external server, on the external service rather, configure an event to trigger the webhook, and there'll be a user interface on the external service for doing that. Usually you have to log in to access that user interface. And then provide a URL to your application. And that URL is essentially, in the world of web APIs, you're providing it with an endpoint, a URL endpoint to get to your application. On your server, what you have to do is you have to create an agent or some process to receive that webhook. And again, it's coming in as an HTTP post request. The reality is kind of a little bit more complicated. Configuring a webhook is going to be different for each and every service. The data structure is going to be different for each and every service. In most cases, you'll need to write custom code to process the webhook for each service. In fact, you may need to write custom code to handle different events within the same service. And yet some services have literally dozens of events. I think Zoom might have 100 different events you can have webhooks for. So yeah, essentially writing a full-blown webhook processor to handle all of Zoom is, quite a bit of work. But a lot of times you only need a few specific events, such as, meeting start, meeting end, meeting was canceled by someone. Getting that kind of information, you can do a lot with. So we're going to look at some examples of how you configure webhooks and then show at least some structural examples of how you might handle the programming of webhooks, although programming is so much different depending on the webhook content itself. This really isn't a talk on how you create that kind of programming. Start with Eventbrite. Eventbrite is an event management and ticketing service. If you registered for this conference, by the way, you must have used Eventbrite to do it. And actually, webhooks were created from Eventbrite and sent to the Collabsphere server using some of the functionality that I wrote. So let's assume we're organizing this conference using Eventbrite. And we want Eventbrite to send a webhook whenever a new ticket order is placed. In the language of Eventbrite, they refer to the trigger action, the trigger as an action. And that terminology is pretty specific to Eventbrite. Most other places call it an event. But I think since Eventbrite is in the business of managing big public events, they didn't want to mix their language and say an event means something else. So they call an event an action in this case here. So the specific action is order placed. And you'll see in a little bit why it has this particular syntax. It's really how they define it at Eventbrite. The action is order.placed. Okay, to configure a webhook, you start by logging in. We're going to log into Eventbrite. And this is just the standard public Eventbrite website. And I'm logged in as Bill Tester. I go down to account settings. Then I go over to developer links and then to webhooks. And if you're curious how I know that this is where I go, there are no guides for this. It's going to be different on each and every service. You just have to explore the service or Google it or do some research to figure out where the heck, when you're logged into that external service, how you get to configuring webhooks. When you finally get to the Manage Webhooks page, it's actually pretty simple. There's a great big burnt orange button called Add Webhook. And when we click on that, it goes to a simple page for adding the webhook. Now, in this case, there are three things we need to provide. We need to provide the payload URL, which is just the endpoint URL that's going to point to your server and your application so that the webhook can get to it. That means you not only have to have a DNS registration for that server so that you can actually have a fully qualified domain name to access it. Essentially, the specific server and even the specific process on that server, for example, let's say an agent name would have to be incorporated into the URL. You then select the event, and then you select the actions. And if you see the action we were talking about before, order.placed, yep, there's a checkbox right there for that particular action. So of the events, when you click on the events list, pretty much all of the events your account is associated with in Eventbrite will show up there. Notice you can select an individual event, such as Collabsphere 2021, or you could do all events, and that's perfectly fine. It means that any event currently in there or any future event you set up in your account, boom, it's going to send you a webhook. For now, I'd like to limit it just to Collabsphere 2021 online webhooks. And after making that selection, I go down here and I've selected order.placed. Notice again, these are checkbox options. So you could set it up to have any number of these particular webhooks sent to your endpoint URL. I think you can also activate all of them, which is going to generate a huge amount of activity. But again, when you receive the webhook, inside there will be a parameter called the action. And you can just read the action and know, oh, this is an order placed one, so I process it this way. This one is an event created one, so I process it differently. It is really possible then to create a webhook processor for Eventbrite that could do all of these in the same batch of code. But to keep things simple today, we're just going to make this the order placed one. I've thrown in essentially our endpoint URL. It's pointing to a Phora Group server. Do not try to use this URL. It will not take you anywhere. It will not do anything. It is a fictitious one for sample purposes only. I go down, click on Add Webhook, and boom. Down here is where the new webhook shows up. And it has a test button by it. And if you click on the test button, and not all services give you a test capability, the test button will then send kind of a dummy webhook to your endpoint URL. And that's a good way to test it to make sure communication's working, that the external service can get to your server and to your application. The body content of that test webhook probably will be just blank or gibberish, so you can't actually process it, but it is a very good way to test what's going on. So at this point, you've configured the external service to send a webhook to you. So now what do you have to do? Well, you have to actually write the code that's going to handle the webhook. As long as you're writing code that can receive and process HTTP post requests, you can use any language you want. In my case, it's kind of like an old fuddy-duddy who's always done Domino server stuff. I do it in LotusScript. I've done it in Java. And actually, I kind of sometimes prefer LotusScript in Java using the old LS2J. I've had great success with the stuff. It seems to work fine, very reliable. Haven't really had any problems at all. Oh, just an extra note. Yeah, you need the HTTP task running. I assume anyone familiar with creating a web API on a Domino server would know to do that. But there are some other ways around that as well. For example, you could have some alternative, essentially web engine running in front of your Domino server. But let's assume in this case, it's all done on the Domino server using the HTTP task. So we're creating a LotusScript agent to actually do all of this processing of the webhook data. It's going to be a web callable agent. The agent has to reside somewhere. It's probably going to live inside of a database. In fact, an awful lot of the code and the things that you do in Domino live inside of databases. The first thing I want to point out is that since the external service is going to call you anonymously, they're going to not have any authentication credentials whatsoever. You have to be able to receive such a call into your server and into your application. The normal way a lot of people would do it is just to allow the database to allow anonymous access. And I just want to tell you that's really not a good way to do that. That's a very bad way to do it. There's no reason that you have to allow the entire database to have anonymous access. Lock down the database, allow only readers and hire to have web access to it. In some cases, they don't even need that level of access. You could restrict it even further. But as long as you allow public access to that specific agent, you will be fine. The rest of the database could be thoroughly locked down. You don't have to worry about it. But just in the agent properties box, down where it has allowed public access users to view and run this agent, if that is checked, then yeah, anonymous access people can then go in and run that particular agent, and the incoming webhook call from the external service will be processed, received and processed. An extra note, security on the agent. In most cases, you don't need any extra security. So just setting the agent security to #1, do not allow restricted operations, is perfectly fine. However, there are some cases where in that same bunch of code where you have to receive the webhook, you may have to make an outbound web call, essentially an outbound post or GET, to get additional information from that service. For example, the service may tell you an order was just received, but it doesn't provide you that much information about it. So you immediately want to make a call to get all the information you can about that order. In that case, you may need to run an outbound web API call to that particular service. And depending on the technology you're using, you may have to that may count as a restricted operation. I know if I do that using Java, for example, I would have to set that to a 2. Okay. Conceptually, this is kind of like the crudest, simplest way to structure a web agent. Essentially, you dimension a notes session, a notes database, a notes document, and a string. Mostly you want to just populate this string with the body content of that webhook. Essentially, we just, since this is going to be initiated by an incoming post call, when it starts up, we essentially just get a new session. And this thing down here, we're setting our notes document object called curdoc to session.documentContext. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with doing this. When you do that, the curdoc document essentially allows access to all of the CGI variables associated with that post call. And the CGI variable we're most interested in this case is the one that's called request_content. So we can pretty much get our string called webhook content by just looking at request content of that notes document object. Once we have the webhook content, boom, we go with whatever processing you want to do with that. If it happens to be JSON, then you parse it in JSON. If it's XML, you parse it in XML. Once it's parsed, you can access any of the variables or parameters or objects inside of it, and then do whatever programming is appropriate for that particular application. So how's the data in the webhook structured? Well, it's different for each service, which is a bummer because it means you kind of have to relearn it and write new code all the time. But if you know what's in JSON or XML, at least you know the first steps are always the same. You have to receive it, get it into the form of a string, and then parse it. Oh, here's another problem. It could actually be, even for the same service, it may be different for different triggers and events within that service. Here's an example of the content that we get from Eventbrite for that order placed webhook. As you can see, it's in JSON. It doesn't give you a lot of information. It does tell us the action, though. In this case, the action is order placed. But aside from that, this is kind of useless. Eventbrite kind of uses a webhook model in which they send just the bare minimum amount of information. They've told you an order has been placed, but then they do give you this thing up here. They call it the API URL. Essentially, they're saying, hey, here's an API URL. Make an outbound call to us using this API URL, and assuming you're configured with us to do this kind of stuff, to make API calls to us. And then using that API call, you can do a get operation, a get method, and then pull down all of the information about the order. So essentially, the webhook, all it tells you in this case is that an order has been placed, but they give you a URL here, so you do a get operation on that, and then boom, you get the whole package of information relating to that order. And that's actually exactly what we did for the Collabsphere application. Essentially, we received a webhook and then used that to then pull down more information. Here's one for Zoom. This is the, Zoom is the service. In fact, we're using Zoom right now again for this meeting. Zoom is the service for running meetings, online meetings, live online meetings. And in this case, this is the webhook for the meeting started event. So if you've scheduled a meeting, that just gets it scheduled. But when someone actually starts the meeting, then this webhook is sent if the server was configured to, if the service was configured to send out webhooks. They don't use the word action, they just call it an event. This is the meeting.started event. And the word event is more standard overall, I would say, than action. The payload in this case, again, this is just one big string of JSON. The payload in this case provides a little bit more information than the Eventbrite one did. For example, it tells you that the start time was here. You know, that's the time when the meeting was actually started. It gives you the meeting ID. And with that piece of information, you have a lot of information right there. Incidentally, it also tells you a few useful things, such as the name of the meeting, the duration, type 2, which I think is either webinar or meeting. I can't remember off the top of my head. But consider an application that you've written where it's actually interacting with Zoom to schedule the meeting. In that case, you already know the meeting ID that Zoom assigned to each of those sessions. And that's actually stored somewhere in the Collabsphere database. So when we receive an incoming meeting started webhook, all we have to do is look at this meeting ID. We know exactly which document in our sessions database to update and say, oh, wow, this meeting has started. Let's indicate that by updating the status of that particular session. So I'm now going to stop sharing for just a moment. See if we actually still have any attendees. Yes, attendees are still there. Good. Have not lost the attendees yet. And now I'm going to try sharing a different application just for a moment. Wow, this looks like Domino, doesn't it? It's exactly what you can see in Domino. As you can see, there are 4 sessions currently going on right now. This is the sessions in progress view. And literally what's going on is that whenever a session in Collabsphere starts up, a webhook is received, it's processed, and then the status of that particular session is updated from scheduled to in progress. And when the meeting is over, it gets changed again to over. So at any point in time, I can just look at this one view and possibly refresh it, and it'll show me what's going on at this particular time. So by using webhooks and updating some kind of a visual interface, you can actually make a dashboard that's very up to date with this push information showing you what's going on at any one time. And yes, I can confirm that the Hooked on Webhooks meeting is going on. So now if I can successfully get back to where I left off, yes, here we are. Oops, not quite. I can master webhooks, but jumping between applications sometimes in here is a bit of a challenge for me. Okay, so we've looked at Zoom. Oh, now it's DocuSign. This is a DocuSign webhook. And the first thing you're going to say is that this isn't JSON anymore. No, this is XML. And it's not only XML, it's a lot of XML. We're only seeing, I'd say, about 10% of the XML for this particular webhook. It's a monster, huge amount of stuff it sends. If Eventbrite sends you the minimal amount of information and Zoom sends you a reasonable and usable amount of information, DocuSign sends you everything except the kitchen sink. Maybe it does send you the kitchen sink as well. What this webhook represents is that you use DocuSign to electronically sign a document. So if I'm doing a real estate contract and it needs signatures from 7 or 8 people, upload it to DocuSign, and it'll cycle it from one person to the other to the other. And in the webhook, it records all the information about who has signed it yet, what time they signed it, who it's going to be signing it next, that stuff. There's a huge amount of information. DocuSign assumes the model that they don't want you making additional calls to get that information. They send literally everything you need to know about this particular document, and they call the document an envelope. Everything about that envelope is in the webhook, so you just parse it out in XML and you can do anything you want with it. So things are different between Eventbrite to Zoom to DocuSign. So where do we find out about these data structures and formats? Well, all the web services contain documentation on their webhook formats. You may need to do a lot of digging to find it, and that's what I've found. And sometimes the documentation is really easy, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's easy to find, sometimes it's not. Googling is your friend. Google the name of the service, the word webhook, and then maybe even a specific webhook you're looking for, and you can probably find some good examples. A lot of services will also have associated web forums for their developers. That's another good place to look as well, but I really haven't found many places that have like a good comprehensive description of everything about using their webhooks. I think the developers that work with it know it better than the documentation at the company that it's associated with. So, okay, so just to run through a quick one more configuration this time for Zoom. Zoom is an online meeting conferencing service. We're actually using Zoom right now. Let's assume we're using Zoom to schedule an online meeting and we want to receive webhooks whenever a meeting starts. Okay, so we log into Zoom, and first thing I'm going to do there is I go to Solutions and Marketplace. Why that? I don't know. That's just where they decided to put all the stuff for developers and doing apps and webhooks. So you have to know that you go from Solutions to Marketplace. And then, this is interesting, once you get to the Marketplace, you go to Develop, and then you choose Build App. Again, how would you know that? You have to Google around for it or ask or just experiment by selecting everything under the menu until you find it. The reason why they do that, by the way, is that in the world of Zoom, pretty much all of the developer interaction is done through apps. An app may actually represent a real application that interacts directly with Zoom, but it also could just be like a wrapper around your webhook or whatever you're doing, and the wrapper just contains identifying information about you and your company so that they know, well, who's doing this webhook, why are they doing it, does the webhook have a name? So we do develop, build apps, and boom, we have the screen here that allows us to make all of these different kinds of apps. But our eye kind of gravitates right away down to this easy one called Webhook Only. And that's actually the one that I'll be going through right now. But I just wanted to mention, the JWT one also lets you create webhooks. In fact, I already have a JWT app created. I do almost all of my stuff through a single JWT app for Zoom in terms of creating meetings and updating meetings. But that one JWT app, in addition to creating, essentially allowing me to use my applications to interact directly with Zoom, it also allows me to configure webhooks. And I suspect that each one of these app types also provide a webhook capability. Let's go into the webhook one itself. I've already kind of written in a name for this one. First, they ask you for a name, my webhook, my Zoom webhook connector. A little bit more information they want. So it has the app name, it has a description, it has a company name, and then it has some specific information about me. I advance it a little bit further down. And in this case here, under features, the thing that lets you do webhooks is the event subscriptions. Creating a webhook in Zoom is creating a subscription to an event. So I turn that on, and then there's a little button there, add new event subscription. Click on that. Oops, I didn't want to do that. Click on that, go forward. I put in a name for that subscription. Again, endpoint has to go in there. That's the URL to my server in my application. And then the real fun is when you go down and click on add events. And you get this whopping big list of events that you can actually get at from Zoom. Right now, I'm just looking at meeting-only events. So these are different types of events. And for the meeting event, as you can see, I have about 10 listed here, but this scroll bar goes quite a bit further. There's probably about 20 different events just for a meeting, a similar number for webinars and recordings. So yes, Zoom has a huge number of events you can set up webhooks for. So you could actually, if you wanted something really fun and cool, you could make an amazing dashboard just of Zoom activity going on. But for simplicity and for the sake of time, we're just going to do a start meeting event. The process of configuring a webhook is somewhat, that's all there was to it. After that one selection, close that screen, do a save, webhook is really running and ready to go. The process of configuring a webhook is somewhat similar for all the services. It's just the details of doing it are different for each one, and finding where in the login UI you actually do it is really something of a pain. A certain amount of research has to be done for all of the webhooks, research on the structure of the webhook, and then you may wind up having to write specialized code just to handle that data structure. Yeah, this seems like a lot of work, but a successful webhook can be used for years. The original code that I wrote in 2016 for DocuSign is still working today. I added stuff to it, but whole sections of that code have remained unchanged since then. Not only that, if you already have a webhook working for one service, it's really just minor changes to get it working for some different trigger at the same service. So getting one thing working for a service takes some time, but adding additional stuff to it a little at a time is pretty easy. Okay, some enhancements to webhooks. These are like extra things you don't really need to know, but they're kind of handy and useful. When you're creating your web point, when your endpoint URL, again, this is the URL that the webhook is going to use to find your server. You could stick onto it a query string. As far as I know, the webhook company itself, that service, they completely ignore that. They don't care what you have on your query string, but they will very religiously include that query string you specify in the webhook. And that actually is kind of a useful thing to do, because you can put extra information in that query string, if it's applicable, to help you identify where that webhook's coming from, if it's associated with a certain one of your customers. And sometimes I throw in just a weird number. I call it like an SID or something. I just use that as kind of like a rough level security. I mean, the code is going to check to see if an SID number equal to this is there. If it's there, good. If it's not there, it'll just kick it out and figure this is some attempt to hack into my server. Getting at the query string is actually quite just as easy as getting at the content, the request content. Essentially, in Lotus script, it's just query string is a string, and in the context document, curdoc, it's just query underscore string. Now that will give you, I think, the URL encoded version, so you'd have to un-URL encode that yourself. But there's also a CGI variable built into Domino for these things called query string decoded. And just getting at that one, boom, you get one that's already ready to use. You don't have to URL unencode it. As I said, you can use the query string parameter just to include a lot of additional information. So it's a very useful thing to use. I sometimes use it when I'm dealing with multiple customers and I want to have just a single webhook processor deal with webhooks coming in from different customers. Actually, that helps quite a bit, because inside the body content itself, it may not actually give you that information. Enhancements. Some webhooks provide HTTP headers that can be really useful and that you can read. Headers, I think, are just generally more secure than query strings. Zoom has a nice feature. You can set up a security token in Zoom, go in and log into Zoom and go into your webhook information account. And there you can actually specify or let them assign to you a very long multi-digit number as an authentication header. And that will appear as a header in the incoming webhook. And to get at the header, just like dimension a string like security token, go to that context document object, and just quite literally for a Zoom, you just put in HTTP underscore authorization of parentheses 0. For those who aren't aware of it, Lotus script actually supports more than just those CGI variables listed in the CGI variable table. You can get it at actually custom headers all over the place quite easily. If a header is named header name, all you have to do is put HTTP underscore in front of it, if that's the actual name of it, and then you can get at the header value, even for CGI variables that aren't in the official Domino CGI table. So. Is it necessary to acknowledge a webhook? I've tried it both ways, and I've actually never seen a difference in behavior. So short answer is I don't think so. I think you can just ignore that. Normally, if you're writing a web agent, you send stuff back in response to it using just a print command. You could print OK, you could print some JSON. The The webhook documentation may actually say specifically what they want sent back, but 90% don't say to send anything back. And the ones that do, I've actually tried it both with and without sending anything back, and I've not seen a difference in behavior. So with a little bit of caveats, I'd say in most cases, you don't really need to respond back to the webhook. So what can go wrong? Oh, lots of stuff. Of course, your server has to be running and your server has to be able to receive webhooks. If your internet or firewall is down, you may miss getting a webhook. Most services are not interested in doing multiple attempts to send you a missed webhook. You know, a few are. A few, if they cannot connect, will try again later on. But since webhooks are designed to operate, you know, get you information quickly and in a timely fashion, if it comes in hours later, it really is kind of useless anyway. So trying to keep your system up so that there are no problems on your end with receiving the webhook is pretty darn important. Remember that, didn't want to go advanced yet. If you have a firewall that blocks ranges of IP addresses so that only certain people can access you, then since the external service company has to access your server, you will have to open up its IP addresses in your firewall. And something like Zoom or DocuSign, they have whole huge ranges of IP addresses. So you may have to do a lot of configuration to make sure those get through. If you don't have any limits on IP addresses, then you don't have to worry about that. Oh yeah, webhooks can be delayed. And this is a real problem for certain services. I've only seen this happen in Eventbrite, and I don't mean to knock Eventbrite because I think they're wonderful and their stuff is really good. But there have been many cases I've seen where in the middle of a busy week, an order comes in, and usually you'll get the response within seconds. The webhook will arrive right away. I've seen cases where it's delayed by 10, 20, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour or more. I somehow think that their webhook sending capability just can't handle the certain types of volumes. This actually happened to us here, I think on Tuesday morning, right around the time just before the opening general session. Webhooks were being delayed by something like 30 or 40 minutes. So we had to kind of manual, for people who registered just before Collabsphere started, some of those cases we had to manually set them up just because the webhooks were not coming in a timely fashion. If you are using Lotus Script to do a web agent, then there's also some things you should be aware of. The body of the content may exceed the node's document size, and the standard node's document, I think it's 64,000 bytes. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but if you exceed that size, the document context object document will break. And instead of getting all of that content or even a truncated version of it, you'll get either 0 or maybe 1 or 2 characters. And that's a major problem. A workaround is that you can actually, another way to get at the content of a webhook, there's a CGI variable built into it called request content, and then it has numbers on the end, 00N, which is 00, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Essentially, if the content is going to exceed its document size, it'll break it up into smaller versions of this using this type of syntax for the CGI variable name. And here's just a quick example of a way to read in the request content. Essentially, first it looks for request content. If it finds that, it goes down here and just reads the dot values of 0 of it, and boom, it has it. On the other hand, if it can't find an object by this name, it tries looking for an object by the name request content, followed by 001, 002, 003, and then it just reads all of those until it can't find any more. It concatenates them all together into one string, and then you have your content. So that gets around that problem quite well. Other problem, Lotus Script web agents may have difficulty reading UTF-8 characters. I see this all the time. They like to convert things into something called LMBCS, Lotus Multi-Byte Character Set. This is ungodly and ridiculous. I can send outbound on my web agents. I can send UTF-8 characters. I can do requests to external services and get content back in UTF-8 characters. I can even get my notes documents to work with UTF-8 characters. But when a web agent receives post content in, the only string I can get out of it is this LMBCS. So if someone has a good way around that, I'd like to know. Right now, that is kind of something of a pain we have to work around. Another thing that can go wrong, hackers are always looking for vulnerabilities, and anonymous public access functionality is irresistible to hackers. So there's a lot of stuff you should be routinely checking on your incoming API calls. Check the query string length. Extremely long string lengths, like thousands of characters, are an attempt to try and overflow buffers. So try to read the character length. If it's too long, kick it out. Check the post content size. If it's 10 times longer than you think it should be, that's a bad sign too. When parsing and reading individual strings or individual variables out of the content, anything that seems like 10 times longer than it should be is probably a sign of something wrong. In summary, webhooks are extremely useful. Setting up webhooks requires research to configure them and understand the data format for each and every service. And that's kind of the downside of using them. And you also have to write specific code for each webhook. But once created, webhooks can be very reliable and they last for a long period of time. Again, I have DocuSign webhook code that's been working since 2016, and it's been called literally thousands of times by many companies. So that gets me to the end. So if there are any questions and answers, let's go ahead with that. Now things are coming in so fast, I can't read them. Okay, if I recall, someone says, if I recall correctly, there's a C3UG video about the new on parser objects added to Lotus script that talks about LMD. I'm gonna look for that. That actually would be a good thing to know. So far, I'm using my own parsers in all of those cases because I've had some issues using the ones with Domino, but that could be useful. How is Webhooks related to REST API and web services? Well, I kind of view webhooks as functioning in the realm of REST APIs, except you're writing the REST API to receive the webhook. In a way that resembles, you're kind of providing web services to the webhook. That's why I call it a reverse webhook or service in general, since instead of you defining how it's going to be operating, the external people who want to use it define it and say, build it this way. Yep, one way to avoid hackers is to whitelist IP addresses. I agree with that very much. Of course, in this case, you may have to whitelist all of those companies, all of the third-party companies, the external services that need to access your server. And some of them have just huge numbers of ranges that you have to configure. It does get to be kind of annoying, but it's a good thing to do. Which version of Domino for the new parse? Ooh. I know they added a JSON parser into Domino recently, but I tried it and it left something to be desired. So the parsers I'm using essentially are Phora Group parsers that we kind of wrote ourselves in Domino and Lotus script, and they work pretty darn well. But I'm really waiting for like the uber great parser from Domino to come out because it's something that should be in every piece of software these days. I just can't think about not having a really great parser. All web pages, if they're running on a browser, have an incredible parsing capability in JSON just right there natively. So we really need that in Domino. Okay, looks like I'm winding down on most of the questions. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. If anything useful came out of it, I'm very happy to share that stuff because it just took a lot of experience to find these things and a lot of pulling out of hair and things to get to that point.